Hey guys, tonight we wander into the flickering hush of medieval Europe, a place where time moves slower than molasses in winter, and candles melt down beside parchment crowded with delicate ink. The corridors are quiet, but somewhere between the sound of quills scratching and beeswax dripping, a different kind of science is stirring. You won't find beakers bubbling or chalkboards scrawled with equations, but if you listen closely, you might hear the hum of a woman calculating the phases of the moon, or deciphering a forgotten herbal cure that smells like boiled onions and regret. You probably won't survive this if you're expecting explosions or flashy lectures. This is not that kind of science. This is quiet brilliance, sewn into veils, hummed beneath hymns, and hidden in margins so narrow they nearly vanish into the spine of time. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'd love knowing where you're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the scriptorium of a stone convent nestled deep in the French countryside. It smells like beeswax, damp vellum, and lavender-stuffed windowsills. A nun hunches over a manuscript, her fingers smudged with soot and gold leaf. Her name lost to time. But the margins she decorates glow with little astronomical symbols. Peeking out behind curling vines and bored-looking saints, she pauses her illumination work to gaze out at the moon, calculating its cycle not for mysticism, but for medicine. She's been tracking local women's ailments, noticing patterns, and her notes hidden between psalm verses suggest that she's getting close to something that sounds a lot like an early menstrual calendar. No, you won't find her in your high school biology textbook, but here she is, her ink drying beside a half-finished Virgo constellation. Mainstream historical fact. Though most medieval scientific records are credited to monks, noblemen, or university scholars, many foundational insights, particularly in medicine, herbalism, and astronomy, were preserved and even advanced by women working in religious houses. The convent wasn't just a spiritual refuge, it was a micro-laboratory of ideas, a monastic think tank with better food and stricter curfews. And not all of these women were cloistered. Some worked as midwives, herbalists, or even unofficial astronomers outside the walls. They tracked comets from gardens and tested poultices in kitchen corners. They wrote treatises under pseudonyms or slipped their findings into letters disguised as prayerful reflections. Genius. With just a dash of "please don't burn me." Fringe tidbit. In some abbeys, nuns were given the right to approve medicinal procedures and oversee the copying of scientific texts. One letter from the 11th century shows a prioress requesting a newer astrolabe because the old one insults geometry. Honestly, we get it. You continue down the corridor where another nun is boiling herbs in a copper pot. Steam curls into the air, sharp with thyme and something you can't quite place, possibly turnip. She's crafting a remedy for stomach troubles, and you suspect it has a 50-50 chance of working or just tasting like compost, but she's got a notebook, and her measurements are precise. This is early data collection. Hypothesis, experiment, result. The scientific method, long before the Enlightenment showed up in powdered wigs and demanded credit. Outside, the garden bursts with medicinal plants comfrey, rue, valerian. Bees hum between the rows. The gardener, Sister Aurelia, is kneeling in the dirt, muttering about seasonal changes and soil acidity. She doesn't know the word pH, but she knows what it feels like when the earth goes sour. She's adjusted her compost recipe accordingly. She's not just growing plants, she's managing ecological systems by instinct and observation. Historians still argue whether these contributions qualify as science in the formal sense. But then again, the formal sense was largely defined by men with desks, coats, and the benefit of being believed. You sit on a low stone wall and breathe in the strange, peppery scent of calendula. A novice walks past you with a basket of dried foxglove, her eyes flicking upward as she mutters dates under her breath. You realize she's memorizing lunar phases, cross-referenced with births and deaths from the last year. Her chart, scratched into wax tablet, looks suspiciously accurate. Somewhere out here, under robes and modesty, lies a human computer with calluses. As the sun dips behind the convent tower, a bell tolls, and the sisters gather for evening prayer. Their hands are folded, but their minds are restless, half in scripture, half in star maps, herbal inventories, and symptom ledgers. You linger a while longer, the scent of rosemary and old books curling around your shoulders. Tonight, you begin a slow, deliberate journey, not through the loud halls of academic science, but through the forgotten rooms where women careful, quiet, and astonishing built a body of knowledge that shaped medicine, astronomy, and chemistry, even as the world ignored their names. You blink away the last of the candlelight and find yourself walking through the misty Rhine Valley. The scent of damp moss and crushed chamomile thick in the air. The year is somewhere in the 12th century, but time here feels more like fog than fact. Ahead, on a gently sloping hill, sits a Benedictine abbey, its windows glowing with a soft orange light. Inside those stone walls, a woman is about to blend cosmic visions with cold medicine and somehow make it all make sense. You climb the hill, your boots sticking slightly in the mud. A faint melody reaches you chanting, but sweeter, layered with something unexpected, a harp, maybe a psaltery. You step through the arched door just in time to see her standing there. Hildegard of Bingen, composer, mystic, medical theorist, intimidatingly talented. She's explaining a diagram, yes, in Latin, but don't worry. She's generous with metaphors. The drawing shows a human body surrounded by planetary rings. Everything is connected. She's saying the blood, the stars, the soul. You smile. She's not wrong. Just several centuries ahead. Mainstream historical fact. Hildegard was one of the most prolific thinkers of her time. Her writings spanned theology, natural science, medicine, and music. She described everything from migraine auras to herbal contraceptives. And her book Physica remains a sprawling herbal encyclopedia. It's got cures for fevers, digestive troubles, melancholy, and at least one oddly specific remedy involving powdered oyster shell and goat bile. We don't recommend trying it. You walk with her through the abbey's apothecary room, where bundles of dried herbs hang from the rafters like aromatic chandeliers. She picks up a jar of ground myrrh and waves it under your nose. For phlegm, she says cheerfully. And conversation. You pause at a wooden table covered in parchment scraps recipes, astrological charts, anatomical sketches. One scroll lists symptoms for too much black bile, which she attributes to lunar imbalance, a sluggish liver, and possibly your attitude. Still, her attention to detail is astonishing. Fringe tidbit Hildegard described a phenomenon that modern scholars believe could be migraine aura, visual disturbances that appear as shimmering lights or patterns before a headache. She called them visions, but they may have been neurological events she transformed into theology and music. Talk about turning pain into art. The abbey itself hums with activity. Novices carry jugs of water from the spring. Scribes prepare vellum for copying, and a small group rehearses a liturgical chant composed by Hildegard herself. The melody rises like steam, strange and beautiful. You realize she didn't just catalog herbs, she scored the rhythm of healing itself. You peek into her garden, where fennel, rosemary, and rue grow in neat rows. Fennel, she says, suddenly behind you. Cools the heat of the mind. You make a note. Also good with fish. A young nun approaches, holding a parchment trembling in her fingers. Mistress, she says softly, what if my dreams are too loud? Hildegard takes the parchment, reads the scrawled shapes half music, half diagrams and nods, then write them down before they deafen you. The girl sighs in relief. Historians still argue whether Hildegard truly practiced medicine in the hands-on sense or merely compiled observations. But in a time when women weren't allowed to attend universities or formally study science, Hildegard's intellectual reach is almost laughably audacious. And somehow, she got away with it. You sit beside her as she grinds herbs in a mortar. Everything has a vibration, she says. A signature from creation. You glance down at her notes. Ginger root for vitality, lavender for sorrow, horseradish for ambition. Even the humors respond to music. She adds, you don't doubt it. She's already writing a chant to ease arthritis. Later, in the chapel, she climbs the steps to an organ and plays a tune that makes your ribs ache in the best way. Her eyes close, and her fingers move like she's conducting the stars themselves. You look around. The sisters are silent, but you can tell they feel it too. The abbey walls are cold stone, but somehow you feel warmer here. Not just because of the fire or the fennel tea, but because in this strange little world, a woman was allowed to think broadly, deeply, and out loud. As the night deepens, she returns to her writing desk, dipping her pen and drawing careful lines between stars, organs, and herbs. It's not chemistry, not yet, but it's proto-science philosophy and biology in a medieval duet. You leave quietly, the stars spinning overhead. Somewhere behind you, Hildegard's chant continues, drifting through stained glass and rosemary steam. You step into the dark knowing that this was no anomaly. She was one of many. And next, a woman named Trotula is about to show you how to talk frankly about female anatomy. In Latin, you shuffle your feet through a narrow, sun-warmed street, paved in weathered stone. The salt air nips at your sleeves, and somewhere nearby, a fishmonger is trying to convince a monk that his catch is absolutely fresh. You're not here for fish, though. You're here for knowledge, and this sleepy town on the southern Italian coast is about to blow open your idea of what medieval medicine looked like. You're in Salerno, sometime in the 11th or 12th century, and the bells of the Scuola Medica Salernitana are ringing softly in the distance. This school, Europe's first official medical academy, isn't just attracting men with scrolls and egos. It's also home to one of the most remarkable women you've never heard of, Trotula. No last name, just Trotula. Like Beyoncé, but with more tinctures. Mainstream historical fact. Trotula of Salerno is credited with writing or inspiring a trio of medical texts, collectively known as Trotula Minor, Trotula Major, and On the Conditions of Women. These treatises were standard reading for centuries and covered women's health in ways that were shockingly frank, practical, and body positive, considering this was the era of flagellation and leeching. You step through an arched door into a quiet courtyard. Olive trees sway gently, and a small group of women in practical linen tunics gathers around a table covered in jars and diagrams. One of them, slightly older, with ink on her fingers and a bit of sass in her posture. Looks up. "You're late," she says. "It's Trotula, obviously." She gestures for you to sit. On the table is an anatomical drawing of female reproductive organs, not metaphorical, not veiled in allegory, but actual detailed structures. Trotula raises an eyebrow. "Yes, we have these," she says. "And yes, they matter." She talks about menstruation not as a curse or a spiritual stain, but as a biological process. Blocked flow, she says. Flipping a page, warm baths, herbal compresses, none of that demon nonsense. You're impressed, possibly blushing. Fringe tidbit. One of Trotula's remedies for menstrual cramps involved soaking cloth in a concoction of saffron, myrrh, and wine, then wearing it as a compress. Medieval aromatherapy meets DIY spa treatment, though it's not clear how effective it was. But hey, the wine probably helped. A young apprentice brings over a dried fig stuffed with crushed fennel and rosemary. To balance the humors, she says. Trotula nods approvingly. And for the breath, you eat it, it's interesting. Like Licorice took a wrong turn into a monastery pantry. Trotula doesn't just focus on internal medicine. She's also known for writing about cosmetics and skincare because medieval science, like modern science, occasionally veers into the beauty aisle. She lists recipes for lip balms, facial scrubs, and hair tonics, many using rose oil, egg whites, and burnt almond shells. Beauty, she says with a shrug, is part of health. You follow her through the halls of the school, passing tiled classrooms and whispered lectures. Male doctors nod politely, but you can sense their unease. Trotula is educated, direct, and not the least bit interested in staying quiet. Do they respect you, you ask, as she picks up a mortar and pestle? She grins. They cite me. That's enough. Historians still argue whether Trotula was a single person or a composite name used for several female authors, scribes, or healers associated with Salerno. Some think her name was attached later to lend authority to these medical texts. Others argue she was very real and very brilliant and just got blurred out by centuries of scribes who weren't quite ready to say, "This was written by a woman." You step into the herbal room, where bundles of dried sage, rue, and bay leaf hang like upside-down witches. An apprentice reads aloud a passage from one of Trotula's texts. The body is not shameful, but ignorance of it is. The others nod. One girl scribbles the quote into her margin. You do too. Trotula hands you a small pot of cream almond oil, beeswax, and powdered rose petal. For cracked hands, she says. And pride. You rub some on your fingers and smell like a Saint's Day picnic. As the sun sets, you find yourself at the edge of the school garden. The city below glows with torchlight and hearth smoke. A bell tolls softly in the distance. Trotula stands beside you, arms crossed, watching the wind ruffle the fig trees. I wanted to give women language for their bodies, she says quietly. And choices. You nod, realizing her work still speaks centuries later, hidden in footnotes and misattributed manuscripts. But it's there. And as you close your eyes, the sea wind carries her voice off into the night, repeating her words not as history, but as legacy. You wake with the scent of parchment ink still tickling your nose and the low hum of a morning bell echoing somewhere far behind. Your boots are dusty from Salerno's tiled courtyards, but now you're walking somewhere quieter, cooler, cloistered. Stone corridors stretch around you like ribs, and up ahead, candlelight flickers across a row of long wooden tables. You're entering a scriptorium, Where silence isn't just golden, it's mandatory. A nun dips her quill into ink and doesn't look up as you pass. Another hums gently as she outlines a constellation on the edge of a copied manuscript. And behind her, tucked in the shadow of a narrow, arched window, someone is gently polishing the brass arc of an astrolabe. You blink. Wait, what? Yes, that's an astrolabe. And yes, these women know how to use it. Mainstream historical fact. Across many medieval convents, especially in places like Germany, France, and northern Italy, nuns were not just copying religious texts. They were also preserving, annotating, and sometimes actively working with scientific texts on medicine, astronomy, geometry, and natural philosophy. These women weren't just scribes. They were thinkers, and sometimes, quietly, practitioners. You settle on a low bench near a stone shelf stacked with wax tablets, measuring rods, and little bronze tools you can't quite name. A young nun sits beside you, twirling a compass in her fingers while whispering calendar calculations. Feast days must align with moon cycles, she mutters. Can't fast during the wrong tides again? The last abbot got a nosebleed. Her superior strolls over and lays out a chart of planetary movements. We track the sky, she says, pointing to a cluster of dates, and the girl's bleeding cycles. She shrugs. Why not both? Fringe tidbit. Some convents kept detailed observational logs of lunar cycles, eclipses, and planetary alignments. Noting how these phenomena coincided with weather changes, animal behavior, and even shifts in communal mood. They weren't just stargazing, they were proto-statisticians with robes and excellent penmanship. A nun shows you her current project, copying Galen's writings on human anatomy into Latin, with marginal notes referencing headaches caused by too much embroidery. You ask whether that's a real medical condition. She deadpans, only if you sit too close to the stove. As the light changes, a group gathers around a table where another sister demonstrates how to read an astrolabe. Measure the altitude of the sun, she instructs. Calculate the hour. Determine the direction of east. She's calm, methodical, and mildly annoyed when someone fumbles the disc. If you drop it, she warns, you owe me 3 candles. You peek at a nearby manuscript illuminated with soft colors, delicate ink, and hidden in the border. A small woman looking through a telescope that hasn't technically been invented yet. You raise your eyebrow. A nun leans over and whispers, she dreams ahead of schedule. Historians still argue whether women in convents were truly scientists or simply preservers of science, but either way, they kept knowledge alive. During centuries when universities were closed to them and public teaching was forbidden, convents became quiet academies, where science hummed under the veil of piety. You follow a group into the garden where herbs are grown not just for remedies, but for experiments in color extraction. A sister shows you how boiling madder root at different temperatures produces 3 different shades of red. Temperature matters, she says. Don't let anyone tell you this is art. It's chemistry with prettier robes. Back inside, the bell for evening prayer tolls. But the work doesn't stop. Candles are lit. Parchments unfurled, measurements whispered. You catch sight of a wax tablet covered in calculations, not psalms, not penance, but geometry. You lean closer. Triangles, arcs, ratios. Some of the math is shockingly clean. Your modern calculator would feel a little intimidated. At your elbow, a nun laughs gently. You thought we just prayed and sang, she asks, dipping her quill. We do that too. But between the Gloria and the Credo, there's plenty of time for stargazing. You sit with them as they work late into the night, soft chants murmuring beneath the scratch of quills and the clink of measuring instruments. There's no fanfare, no footnotes. But these women are doing the work day after day, century after century, refining calendars, testing measurements, annotating theories. They don't wear lab coats. They don't publish papers. They don't receive awards, but they preserve. And in preserving, they shape the future. As the candles burn lower, the scriptorium softens into a warm glow. The nuns finish their pages, close their inks, and quietly begin rolling up the stars. Tomorrow, you'll walk into gardens blooming with lavender and sage where experiments continue. This time with roots and leaves instead of compasses. But tonight, you drift off to the rustle of parchment, the weight of forgotten brilliance, and the comforting knowledge that even in silence, science finds its voice. You wake to the smell of thyme and damp soil, earthy and comforting like the pages of a book that's been buried too long in a cedar chest. A thin mist snakes along a narrow footpath, guiding you away from the scriptorium's stone arches and toward the walled gardens of a convent tucked deep in a wooded valley. The air is cooler here, and somewhere beyond the hedges, water trickles gently into a stone basin shaped like a scallop shell. This isn't just a garden, it's an experimental space, a medieval version of a lab, minus the Bunsen burners and hazard signs. You follow a nun in a coarse robe as she bends beside a row of calendula, whispering something to the plant. Perhaps a prayer or a polite request to grow straighter. In her basket dried marjoram foxglove, and a few unassuming leaves she says are for digestive purposes. You don't ask. Mainstream historical fact. Throughout the Middle Ages, women, especially those living in convents, were responsible for the cultivation, experimentation, and application of medicinal plants. These weren't just herbalists, they were hands-on pharmacologists, crafting salves, tonics, and poultices with measurable results in real chemical interactions. The nun leads you into a modest stone building attached to the garden, her apothecary kitchen. There's no stovetop, but a hearth glows softly, and rows of clay pots line the shelves like sleepy soldiers. She opens one. The smell hits you like peppery honey. Valerian, she says, for nightmares and overly romantic poets. On the long work table, you see bundles of drying herbs, beeswax curls, crushed bark, and a small copper still for distilling rosewater. She's got 2 batches going, one for soothing skin rashes and one for adding to wine when your guests have better noses than taste. Fringe tidbit. Some convents developed proprietary recipes passed down through generations, essentially medieval formulary traditions. A few of these recipes survive in codices today, including one oddly charming ointment that combines ground snails, rose petals, and olive oil. For what general weakness? As vague and universal as any modern supplement ad. She shows you her notebooks, not scrolls, not illuminated pages, but practical ledgers with entries like Tuesday willow bark worked, fever reduced, Sister Agnes still complaining. Friday tried licorice root on Brother Peter. Result louder burps, otherwise inconclusive. Historians still argue whether women's herbal knowledge in this era should be categorized as folk healing or scientific medicine. But from where you're sitting, elbows deep in chopped sage and soot, there's no question. This is observation, trial and error, dosage adjustment. In other words, science. With the faint scent of oregano, you step into a side room where another nun is bottling tinctures into glass vials, using a steady hand and a very long funnel. The glass is slightly warped, but the labels are neat. inked with Latin names and little astrological glyphs. The moon favors rosemary, she explains, and mint hates Thursdays. Not everything makes logical sense. But then again, not everything modern does either. Cough syrup still comes in grape flavor. There's always a little room for ritual. You help chop some fresh yarrow and place it in a linen bag. For wounds, she says. Stops the bleeding. Works better than prayer. Then she crosses herself. Just in case. In the back of the garden, a small group is tending to what looks like a sick goat. You prepare yourself for a lecture on animal anatomy. But instead, one of the younger sisters offers you a small jar. Inside is a paste made from nettle, garlic, and some kind of clay. It's experimental, she whispers. Don't eat it. You nod solemnly and return it, untouched. Later, as the sun begins to dip, they lay out their tools for cleaning bronze knives, curved spoons, waxed linen strips, and a tiny grater for drying root bark. Everything is washed meticulously, dried, and stored with herbs to ward off mold. The care they take isn't just cleanliness, it's method. Even if it smells like your aunt's spice drawer after a thunderstorm, you sit under a vine-covered trellis, sipping a tea made from lemon balm and crushed apple peels. The taste is mild, a little sweet, and almost certainly medicinal. The nun beside you hands you a folded piece of paper. Inside is a dried flower, pressed flat and labeled in the corner with the name Viola Tricolor for melancholy, forgetfulness, and soft hands. You smile. This is a place where healing and knowledge intertwine, rooted in the dirt but reaching toward something higher, toward patterns, effects, and truths that can be recorded, remembered, shared. Tomorrow, you'll hear the voices of other women who once walked these paths, not just gardeners, but physicians who taught in the open before being erased in silence. But tonight, you wrap yourself in the scent of rosemary and rosewater, tucked into a small corner of medieval science where potions bubble slowly. Moonlight is an ingredient, and wisdom grows by hand. You wake before the bell, wrapped in a linen blanket that smells faintly of lavender and soot. The garden behind you is still shrouded in mist. The herbs curled tight in the early chill. But today, your path leads south again, down from the green cloisters of convent life, and into the sunlit streets of Salerno once more. Only now, you're here to meet the ones most people forget even existed. The ladies of Salerno. They're sometimes called. Not all of them had names, and even fewer had titles. But for a brief golden moment in medieval history, women in Salerno didn't just study medicine, they taught it. You pass under the carved archway of the Scuola Medica Salernitana again, the world's first medical school, where once upon a time, medicine wasn't locked behind male-only gates. The Mediterranean breeze rolls through, and in the courtyard, students, yes, including women, are sitting cross-legged on stone benches, squinting at hand-copied texts under the dappled shade of a fig tree. Mainstream historical fact. During the 11th and 12th centuries, Salerno was an intellectual crossroads. Greek, Arabic, Latin, and Jewish medical traditions converged here, forming a rich medical culture that was shockingly inclusive by medieval standards, especially for women. This wasn't universal or permanent, of course, but for a time, women were active as both practitioners and professors. You sit beside a young woman in a green wool tunic, frantically copying a diagram of the human digestive tract. He said the liver makes you courageous, she mutters, then adds, but only on market days. She looks up and grins. Don't quote me. You walk into a small lecture hall where a woman stands at the front, gesturing at a wall hanging embroidered with botanical illustrations. Yarrow for bleeding, she says. Rue for parasites. And rosemary for your mother-in-law's cooking. The class laughs. Someone takes notes. It's casual, confident, and undeniably academic. You meet a teacher named Abella, or maybe Rebecca manuscripts argue about the name, like historians at a dinner party with too much wine. She's credited with writing about bile balance, uroscopy, yes, the medieval art of diagnosing from pea color, and gynecological treatments. Her tone is brisk, her confidence unshakable. Fringe tidbit. One Salernitan woman, possibly named Mercuriad, is said to have written surgical treatises so clear that later male doctors simply republish them under their own names. The term for this is stealing. The medieval term was anonymous contribution, but we're not buying it. Outside the lecture hall, another woman leads a group through the hospital's open courtyard, teaching students how to spot swelling in the ankles as an early sign of dropsy. She's matter-of-fact, wrapping herbs in bandages as she goes. Circulation begins in the feet, she says, because humility must be learned from the ground up. You nod, unsure if it's metaphor or medicine, possibly both. Historians still argue whether these women were official faculty or guest lecturers tolerated by enlightened male scholars. What's more likely is that they were so useful, so good, that barring them outright would have cost the school too much credibility. A loophole in gender bias held open just wide enough for brilliance to squeeze through. You wander down to the archives, where parchment scrolls with faded ink still bear feminine handwriting rounded, careful, and full of tiny corrections. In one, a margin note. Tested twice. Once with honey. Once with oil. Honey better. You smile. That's not just copying, that's method. In a nearby dispensary, a woman grinds dried linden blossoms with mortar and pestle. For calming the pulse, she explains. Especially when your professor forgets your name. She tilts her head. They always remember my tinctures, though. Later. You attend a symposium. Yes, a real medieval one. Minus PowerPoint, where students present findings to peers and instructors. One woman stands up to explain her work on menstrual regularity using phase charts. The room shifts uncomfortably. She doesn't blink. The moon influences water, she says, and the body is mostly water. A few scribes begin taking notes. At the edges of Salerno, the poorer citizens come for treatment. Women physicians work here too, treating wounds, sewing skin, prescribing poultices, managing childbirth complications. Some patients trust them more than the university men. Gentler hands, one woman whispers, holding her daughter close. You spend the evening beside a small fire in the student quarters. Someone is playing a lyre, badly. Others are arguing over whether dreams can influence digestion. Only if you eat figs at night. Someone says, laughter bubbles through the room. A young student named Isabel wraps her arms around her knees and whispers, we're not supposed to be here, you know? But here we are. And that's the thing. The women of Salerno didn't just exist, they thrived. Taught, published, experimented, and then just as quickly they were erased, pushed out as universities formalized. Male-only gates slammed shut, and medical authority was rebranded as a masculine domain. But for a while, this coastal city shined like a torch, and these women Abella, Mercuriad, Trota, and a dozen whose names never made the parchment kept it burning. Tomorrow, you'll follow the books they helped preserve as they travel north, carried by hands you may not expect. But tonight, you fall asleep on a stone bench under fig leaves, the air warm the stars soft, and the names of the forgotten whispering just beneath your dreams. You drift out of sleep to the clatter of hooves on flagstones and the low murmur of foreign voices echoing through a stone courtyard. The coastal air is gone, replaced by something drier, dustier, and more electric with translation. You've traveled eastward into the rising light of Al-Andalus, the Iberian Peninsula during its golden age of Islamic scholarship. This isn't a place of echoing monasteries. It's a world of libraries, observatories, and universities filled with scholars in layered robes, arguing passionately about Saturn's retrograde and the precise method for distilling rose oil. You're in Toledo, or maybe Cordoba, or some other bustling city where Arabic, Latin, and Hebrew scripts rub elbows in the same margins. And tucked into this labyrinth of minds are women quietly, cleverly, and without ceremony translating science itself. Mainstream historical fact. During the 10th to 13th centuries, much of Europe's lost Greek and Roman science was reintroduced through Arabic translations and commentary, many of which were then translated again into Latin. This vast movement of knowledge included astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. And while most of the known translators were male, evidence suggests women were part of this scholarly engine, especially in scriptoria, Jewish communities, and certain tolerant courts. You enter a shadowy room filled with stacked parchment, ink pots, and the deep, dry perfume of leather bindings and saffron paper. At the center, a young woman dips her pen and carefully transcribes Arabic into Latin, her lips moving silently as she deciphers equations. Astrology, not astronomy. A voice corrects her. She scowls. It's both, she mutters, adding a footnote. She's working on a treatise originally written by Al-Zarawi, the great Andalusian physician. Her job is not just to translate the words, but to understand them. She's not merely a conduit, she's a collaborator. Her margin notes challenge dosage sizes, adjust menstrual cycle lengths for different climates, and once very neatly cross out a claim that uteruses wander like lost sheep. Absurd, she writes, and insulting. You lean over to see her reference book, a worn copy of Galen's On the Use of Parts, now bound in goatskin and scribbled with annotations in 3 languages. She hands you a separate scroll star charts that use both Arabic lunar stations and Ptolemaic spheres. The dates are oddly precise, like someone's been recording alignments over decades. She shrugs. Family tradition. Fringe tidbit. Some women in these communities weren't just scribes, they were mathematicians and astronomers in their own right. There are scattered references to Jewish and Muslim women using astrolabes, interpreting lunar eclipses, and contributing to the development of almanacs, often under male relatives' names, or anonymously, tucked into the edges of larger works. You follow her through the crowded halls of a public library, where shelves groan under the weight of knowledge texts on surgery, pulse-taking, urine analysis, and even veterinary medicine. You think monks invented medicine, she asks? Eyebrow raised. We've had textbooks since your side of the continent was eating soup with the stick. She's not wrong. Historians still argue whether these women were full scholars or just literate assistants. The record is frustratingly quiet, but marginalia, oral histories, and suspiciously perfect translations suggest otherwise. If nothing else, they were bridges not just between languages, but between worlds. In the spice market, another woman sells dried herbs labeled with both their Latin and Arabic names. I don't read, she says with a wink, but I know when cumin fails and when cinnamon cures. She pulls out a book wrapped in linen. My sisters, she says proudly. She writes about blood pressure. She calls it vein storms. Isn't that lovely? You end the afternoon on a rooftop observatory where a girl no older than 15 adjusts a quadrant and squints at the sun. She's calculating the moment of astronomical noon, and when she's done, she scratches the result into a wax tablet with surprising certainty. For prayer, she says, then adds, and predictions. Her aunt calls her down for dinner. You watch as she wraps the quadrant in a cloth with embroidered stars, then tucks it gently under her arm like a favorite book. Back in the library, the translator from earlier shows you her final page for the day. It's a botanical index, comparing the effects of mugwort, anise, and betony across Greek, Arabic, and Hebrew medicine. Different names, she says, same stomach. Tomorrow, the books will move again, carried by monks, merchants, and more translators, heading north to the universities of Paris and Oxford. But tonight, you sleep in a tiled courtyard under grapevines heavy with dusk. The stars above are almost exactly where the girl said they'd be, and somewhere behind the shadows, another woman sharpens her pen not to rewrite the past, but to carry it forward. You rise with the market noise still murmuring in your ears, the scent of spices clinging to your robe. But today, your path curves away from libraries and stars, veering into messier territory birthrooms, barns, and back alley remedies. You're entering the complicated world of medieval midwifery, where women held real power over bodies, life, and death until, of course, someone decided they shouldn't. You're walking now through a village square, somewhere between the late 13th and 14th centuries. The ground is muddy, the air sharp with wood smoke and sweat. Down a side alley, past the baker's shed and a goat that looks at you with suspicion, a door stands ajar. Inside low firelight, the rustle of cloth, the sounds of steady, focused work. This is where the women are. Midwives, herbalists, and lay healers not university trained, not Latin certified, but skilled, experienced, and often more trusted than the official physicians. Mainstream historical fact. In much of medieval Europe, childbirth remained the professional domain of women, especially midwives well into the late Middle Ages. These women managed labor, postpartum care, and even rudimentary surgery. They were educators, healers, and community anchors. But as formal medical institutions grew, especially male-dominated universities, midwives began facing increased scrutiny and competition. You sit quietly in the corner as a woman named Marjorie checks a bundle of herbs hanging from the rafters. Fennel for courage, she says, and mint to keep the room sweet. She checks the fire, then lays out cloths, a bowl of warmed water, and a wooden spoon for the laboring woman to bite if the pain becomes too much. A young girl, her apprentice, perhaps brings over a small tin of salve. Beeswax? Clove? Marjoram, she says. Good for tearing. You nod, realizing that everything here has a purpose. Every motion is measured, every plant remembered. Fringe tidbit. Some midwives kept birth books, recording outcomes, techniques, and even weather conditions. While few survive, one such book believed to belong to a German midwife named Justina contains more than 200 births, including marginal notes like husband fainted, child with teeth, and firstborn, cursed temper. But not all is warm light and lavender. You overhear whispers rumors as doctors from the city lobbying for laws to regulate midwives. They say we use charms. Marjorie scoffs, as if they don't bleed patients by moonlight. She spits into the fire. They want our knowledge, but not our hands. You walk with her through the village. People greet her with nods and tired smiles. She stops to check a woman's healing stitches, then hands a boy a tiny vial of oil. "Rub this on your mother's feet," she says. "It'll help her sleep." The boy beams. Back in the birthing room, she crushes a clove of garlic and folds it into a cloth. "For the smell," she says dryly, "but also for strength." The laboring mother groans softly, her face slick with sweat. A group of women stands close, whispering prayers. But it's Marjorie who keeps time feeling the belly, listening to the rhythm of breathing, watching for signs. Historians still argue whether these midwives should be considered part of medical history or simply folk practitioners. The distinction, of course, is mostly one of record-keeping and status. The outcomes: babies born. Mothers saved speak for themselves. You glance at a dusty corner of the room where a small shelf holds bundles of herbs tied with ribbons, worn leather pouches, and what looks suspiciously like an illustrated manual hand-drawn diagrams of fetal positions, medicinal plants, and stretch-laced wombs. It's informal, but it's also science. Later, you walk into the nearby town, where a group of university-trained physicians in stiff robes are giving a public lecture on childbirth. You lean in. Their diagrams are abstract. Their tone is clinical. Their conclusions: midwives are useful but untrustworthy. One man mutters, "Their hands are too familiar with sin." Another nods gravely. "We must regulate. The shift is beginning." Marjorie hears about the talk later. She's not surprised. "They'll want us licensed," she says. Then silenced. She shrugs and goes back to grinding poppy seeds. But they can't stop labor, or pain, or knowing. Fringe tidbit. In some towns, midwives were required to take oaths before delivering babies, swearing they wouldn't use magic, would report illegitimate births, and wouldn't tempt women to avoid pregnancy. Some oaths were longer than the births themselves. That evening, as the baby arrives, squalling, red, and wet with the steam of the living world, you watch Marjorie wrap it tight and place it into the mother's arms. The room exhales. No chance, no miracles, just skill, timing, and care. You step out into the night. Stars blink above the thatched roofs, and the air is sweet with cooling ash. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rings. Elsewhere, a man in a robe writes a treatise on childbirth without ever having seen one. But here, in the warm dark, the real work continues. Hands wash, herbs steep, and knowledge passes from mouth to ear, from woman to woman. Tomorrow, you'll follow those beliefs into the skies, where the moon's cycle was said to govern bleeding and birth alike. But tonight, you rest in a world of whispered wisdom, hot water, and hands that remember. You wake to the soft echo of bells. Though these don't mark prayer, they mark phases. The moon is high, pale, and full above the horizon. And tonight, its silver light filters through the shutters like a timetable etched in milk. You're still in the medieval world, but now you're stepping into one of its more curious crossroads, the place where biology and astrology meet in quiet rituals and careful observation. This is the realm of moon-led medicine, where a woman's cycle was tracked by the stars, where tides and blood were siblings, and where science tiptoed along the edge of mysticism in a veil stitched with Latin, poppy seeds, and planetary glyphs. Mainstream historical fact: many medieval medical systems, including those taught in Salerno, Baghdad, and Paris, operated on the belief that the moon's phases directly influenced health, particularly in women, menstruation, fertility, seizures, and even mental illness were often mapped alongside lunar charts. And women, those most in tune with the moon, were sometimes seen as both mysterious and medically essential. You walk into a mid-sized village where an older woman with a shawl and a 1,000-yard stare is drawing circles in wax with her fingernail. She marks the full moons, new moons, and the notches in between. This one, she says, tapping a tiny cross. Brought twins last year. You ask if she's an astrologer. She smirks. I'm a gardener with opinions. You spend the morning among women recording their cycles not in secret, but as part of everyday health. One keeps a moon log alongside her herbal diary. Pains during waxing moon, she writes. Better after fennel tea. Another records 3 years of cycle data in a knitted pattern white thread for rest days. Red for bleeding, green for fertility. It's part embroidery, part calendar, and definitely more accurate than most medieval almanacs. Fringe tidbit. There's evidence of lunar charts stitched into clothing or hidden in prayer books, used by women to track their cycles in environments where writing might have been discouraged or dangerous. Think of it as wearable data before the Fitbit. There was the fertility sash. You visit a scriptorium where a nun has begun collecting case notes about menstrual irregularities and their relationship to lunar eclipses. She's suspicious of the wandering womb theory still floating around in medical texts. It doesn't wander, she says. It reacts. You ask what to. She looks out the window. Tides, air, sadness. Probably husbands. Historians still argue whether this lunar logic was grounded in genuine observation or just elaborate folklore. But the truth is messier. Some remedies worked, some didn't. What's certain is that many women were tracking patterns, recording data, and adjusting care based on celestial rhythms. You pause in a small chapel where an illuminated manuscript glows under a beam of light. It's not a Bible passage but a menstrual calendar, hidden inside a saint's halo, with moon phases marked in gold leaf. Someone went through a lot of trouble to make sure this sacred knowledge didn't get erased, even if it had to hide in plain sight. Outside, an herbalist brews something called moon wine, a mix of wormwood, violet, and fennel steeped under the full moon. For balancing the humors, she claims, pouring it into a chipped cup. You try a sip. It tastes like spring soil and stubbornness. Later, you join a gathering of midwives who trade stories about births gone awry during eclipses, bleeding that won't stop during waning moons, and pregnancies conceived when Venus was in Pisces. You ask if they believe it, they glance at each other. Belief doesn't matter. One says, the patterns show up whether you like them or not. One woman shows you her own calculations scrawled on the inside of a grain ledger. She's charted local births against moon phases for 7 years. More girls during waxing, she says. More boys after a new moon. You ask if it's true. She shrugs. More fun to believe it is. You sit with her as night deepens and the moon rises, casting long shadows across the field. She hands you a tiny glass vial. Moon-touched water, she says, for dreams. And stomach cramps. And bad luck. Covers a lot. You lie down near a cluster of lavender bushes, wrapped in a wool blanket that smells faintly of fennel and candle smoke. The moon stares down, indifferent but radiant, while frogs croak in the dark like sleepy philosophers. Tomorrow, you'll enter stranger chambers still where women tinker with glass, salts, and early metals, conducting experiments in hidden workshops that sound suspiciously like labs. But tonight, under this gentle ancient clock in the sky, you rest in a world where observation and myth hold hands, where the moon is a mirror for your blood, and where women wrote science not in books, but in patterns, in gardens, and in time. You wake with your face pressed to the warm stones of a courtyard floor, the faint metallic tang of something once boiled still lingering in the air. There's a different kind of stillness here, not the sacred hush of prayer or the muffled quiet of garden paths, but the focused silence of someone waiting for glass to cool. You're in a narrow chamber attached to a townhome on the outskirts of Bologna. The wooden shutters are drawn tight, the coals are smoldering, and the air smells faintly of vinegar, iron, and something that might be dried plum or mercury. A woman stands at the far end of the room, sleeves rolled high, hair braided and pinned beneath a kerchief, pouring a thin stream of liquid from one flask into another like she's counting time itself. This is not a kitchen. Although it has pots, it's not a chapel. Although it has devotion, it's not a laboratory because that word doesn't really exist yet. But it's definitely a lab. Mainstream historical fact. Though women were excluded from most formal academic science in medieval Europe, many practiced chemistry-like work in private spaces, dyeing, metalworking, fermentation, herbal distillation, even proto-alchemy. These weren't just crafts, they were systematic, experimental, and generational. And in some cases, they helped lay the groundwork for later chemical sciences. The woman, whose name you don't catch, though you suspect it's been erased anyway, adds crushed alum to a thick paste of dried pomegranate peel and rainwater. To fix the dye, she says. Too much, and it crumbles. Too little, and it bleeds. You ask how she learned this. She taps her temple. Mistakes. And sisters. On the shelf above her rows of jars labeled in scratchy Latin and loopy vernacular, one for green vitriol. Another for soot. Another labeled simply, not if you're tired. You do not open that one. Fringe tidbit. Some women developed their own systems of color-fast dyeing, using plants like weld, woad, and madder, combined with mineral salts and boiling cycles. These dye formulas were often guarded family secrets passed from grandmother to granddaughter, never written down, but often replicated through generations of trial and observation. You help stir a thick syrup of honey and copper powder in a small copper cauldron, watching it turn a sickly green before it bubbles into a dull gray paste. For mosaics, she explains, or if you press it flat, for eye paint, you blink. Not for both, she adds, without smiling. On a side table sits a cracked alembic, the kind alchemists use for distillation. It's been re-welded with lead. Inherited, she says. Not safe, but accurate. You watch her funnel steam into a cooling coil, collecting a few precious drops of clear liquid. For tinctures, she murmurs, and sometimes teeth. You glance at a corner shelf where spools of dyed thread hang beside small sacks of ground minerals. The labels are a mix of humor and hazard blue whisper. Coffin soot, elderman's knee, and one that simply reads, maybe don't. Historians still argue whether this kind of domestic science counts in the lineage of chemistry. Some say it was applied magic. Others say it was household art. But anyone who's watched a woman test the exact boiling point of ash water while adjusting pH with lemon rinds would call it what it was, chemical engineering in an apron. In the corner, a younger girl sits sketching a triangle with symbols along the edges. Venus, copper, a crescent moon, and a spiral. It helps me remember, she says. Which metals like heat? Which colors run? Her notes aren't just symbols. They're mental maps. Logic disguised as poetry. Later, you peek into a second room where strips of linen hang dipped in different pigments. Rust, ochre, indigo, vermilion. A chart on the wall tracks which formulas lasted longest in the sun. The experiment's been running for months, maybe years. Sunlight is cruel, the older woman mutters, which is why I love it. She lets you handle a lump of glass she made herself clear with a faint green hue, smooth and a little warm from where it sat beside the stove. Not pure, she says, inspecting your grip, but better than what the monks can melt. Fringe tidbit. There are records of women in 13th century Venice and Bohemia working in glass-blowing and enamel guilds, where scientific precision was disguised as craft. Some historians believe these women helped develop methods of temperature control and color stability that were later adapted into formal chemical labs. The room darkens as the fire burns low. The bottles begin to glisten faintly in the shadows. Little moon-colored domes of something that smells like earth and endings. The woman begins writing in a small book formulas, recipes, maybe warnings. The ink glows faintly gold in the lamplight. You realize she is not trying to become famous. She's trying to pass something on. Safely, carefully, quietly. The work is not about recognition. It's about continuity. Tomorrow, you'll visit an abbey where nuns measure eclipses and track planetary movement, not to tell fortunes, but to calculate time itself. But tonight, you sleep beside a cooling furnace, curled on a floor warmed by centuries of patient, smoldering brilliance. The morning comes slow, sliding through the smoke-stained glass of a long window shaped like a church bell. It touches everything your folded blanket. The pages still open on the work table. The green-streaked glass cooled to silence overnight. You stretch, brush the soot from your sleeves, and follow the whisper of bells that aren't tolling for mass but for math. You're heading into the hills now, toward a high stone abbey perched just beneath the clouds. It's quiet, sure, but not sleepy. Inside these walls, the women aren't just praying, they're measuring the stars, calculating eclipses, and tracking the movements of celestial bodies with a precision that would make Renaissance astronomers raise an eyebrow. You step through a heavy door into a circular chamber that smells faintly of ink, lavender, and the distant hint of thunder. The walls are lined with scroll racks and star charts, and a wooden platform has been built beneath a skylight that opens directly onto the heavens. Mainstream historical fact, though few are widely remembered, there's evidence that many Benedictine and Cistercian nuns, particularly in Germany and northern France, kept detailed astronomical records including observations of planetary movement, eclipse prediction, and calendar calculation. Their work was often tied to the liturgical year but went far beyond it, bleeding into mathematics and timekeeping. You climb the steps to the platform, where a nun in a deep blue habit adjusts a brass instrument that looks like a compass, and a soup ladle had a very academic child. It's a torquetum, and she's using it to chart the angle of the rising sun. We'll correct the feast calendar again, she mutters. They never account for cloud cover. You ask her what she's calculating. The sun's declination, she replies. Also whether Sister Agnes exaggerated again about the equinox. She's half smiling. Maybe. In a side room, another nun sketches a crescent moon and scribbles Latin beneath it, recording the exact hour it vanished behind clouds last night. We take turns watching, she explains. Like shepherds, but for shadows. You peek over her shoulder and notice another set of notes this time, comparing lunar phases with local illnesses. Not medicine, she says quickly. Then pauses. But maybe patterns. You nod. Maybe. Fringe tidbit. Some convents produced elaborate volvelles rotating paper or parchment discs that modeled the movements of celestial bodies. They're early analog computers, and while many are unsigned, Scholars now suspect women were among their makers. Judging by marginalia, hand size, and the occasional doodle of a winking nun, you sit in a long hall with high windows where a group of women work quietly, some copying tables of numbers, others adjusting small sundials or restringing weighted plumb lines. They're calculating the date of Easter, a famously annoying puzzle involving the lunar cycle, the spring equinox, and a touch of holy guesswork. The Pope is often off by a day, one says, marking a correction in red, but we're polite about it. Historians still argue whether these women were simply obeying clerical instruction or acting as mathematical agents in their own right. Some abbesses, like Hildegard of Landsberg, were known to direct whole teams of scribes and astronomers, blending theology, art, and data into vast illustrated encyclopedias. Whether we call it science or sacred duty is mostly about who gets to name things. You walk through a chapel where the floor mosaic includes the zodiac, each sign rendered in colored tile. A woman pauses while sweeping and says, "It reminds us time is larger than liturgy," then continues sweeping. In the workshop, a younger sister is carving a wooden astrolabe, using her thumbnail to check the alignment of tiny degree markings. "This one's for travelers," she says. "For monks who forget how to find east." She hands it to you. It's heavier than it looks, and it smells like beeswax and precision. Outside, clouds drift low over the hills. The air feels charged, like the sky itself is holding its breath. You sit under a tree with one of the sisters as she explains how they chart the seasons, noting bird migrations, frost cycles, and the earliest blooms of herbs. Astronomy, she says, is what happens when prayer meets patience. You ask how long they've kept these records. She pulls out a stack of wax tablets. This is year 203. Not of Christ. Of sunrise data. Fringe tidbit. There's a surviving chart from the 10th century that maps a lunar eclipse with such detail that modern astronomers were able to verify its accuracy within minutes. It's unsigned, but the handwriting matches other convent manuscripts. Most likely, a nun with good eyesight and a warm cloak. As dusk falls, the sisters gather to read their observations aloud, one tracking Venus, another reporting the wind direction, another reciting a riddle about eclipses. You sit at the edge, sipping a warm drink that might be broth, might be steeped lavender, and listen as science is sung into the dark. Tomorrow, you'll trace the edge of silence, the missing names, the anonymous manuscripts, the erasures made not by fire but by indifference. But tonight, you sleep beneath a roof where the stars are measured by hand, where time is a circle of wax and ink, and where women, in stillness, calculate the shape of the heavens. You stir awake beneath a vaulted ceiling painted in faded blue, stars chipped away by time and roof leaks. The air smells like beeswax, worn parchment, and the edge of a story no one finishes. Today, you don't follow footsteps, you follow absence. You walk through a small stone library tucked behind a cloister, the kind that creaks at every hinge and leans just slightly, as if it too is tired of keeping secrets. You pull a dusty manuscript off the shelf, heavy, handwritten, and full of promise. It opens with authority on the humors and the balance thereof. The script is clean, the diagrams are careful, but the name there isn't one, just the word compiled. You run your fingers along the margins. They're light pencil notes, possibly added decades later, attributed to a monk of Milan. But the symbols in the diagrams, they match ones you've seen in nunneries. The handwriting slants in a distinctly feminine way. And next to one of the more technical passages about herbal emetics, a small doodle, a cat batting a sprig of mint. No monk drew that. Mainstream historical fact. Many women in medieval Europe, especially those working in convents or domestic healing, wrote down their observations, experiments, and theories. But when these texts were copied, preserved, or translated, their names were often omitted, misattributed, or replaced. Sometimes by accident, often by design. You leaf through another manuscript, this one on the influence of the womb upon memory. It's smart, it's skeptical. It gently tears apart Galenic theories without ever calling him out by name. But again, no author. Just a scribbled note in the back. From the kitchen of St. Brigid's, fringe tidbit. There are entire catalogues of anonymous medical treatises, mostly in Latin, some in Old French, some in Middle High German that modern scholars suspect were written by women based on internal clues references to midwifery, use of domestic metaphors, and occasional side comments like "ask the laundry girl if unsure." You step into a scriptorium where a manuscript is being copied onto vellum. A young woman scribes quickly, tongue between her teeth, copying a recipe for a poultice made of crushed barley and egg yolk. She adds a side note: if patient is dramatic, add honey. You ask if it's her own formula. She shakes her head. From a woman in Bruges? She never wrote it down. I did. She won't sign the page. Later, you examine a large codex where the opening page reads, "Collected by Brother Thomas." You recognize the structure. It's a mashup of treatises you've already seen, including passages from Hildegard, Trotula, and an unnamed writer who liked to describe blood clots as the body's moody punctuation. Brother Thomas, it seems, was an excellent borrower. Historians still argue whether the removal of women's names from medieval scientific texts was intentional or simply part of broader cultural norms. After all, most authors, men and women, didn't publish the way we think of today. But the pattern is suspicious. When men wrote, their names were preserved. When women did, their names were absorbed, blurred, or erased like ink washed in rain. In a private collection near Ghent, you open a small herbal guide, tiny, bound in green leather, the pages thinner than onion skin. It's full of brilliant, detailed remedies: crushed clover for ulcers, powdered rose hips for fevers, a complicated process for purifying river water using wool and sunlight. The final page reads, in faint, scratchy script, written by a woman who knows. You stand still for a long time. Back at the abbey, one of the nuns tells you about a recipe book passed down through 4 generations of sisters. None of them signed it. We write for each other. She says, names are for gravestones. You try not to wince. Fringe tidbit. Some modern scholars use handwriting analysis, linguistic markers, and even scent traces, the faint residues of herbs or oils left on ancient pages to identify works written by women. Sometimes, the page smells faintly of lavender or mustard seed, common in medieval healing salves and almost always tied to female use. You sit in the courtyard as dusk arrives, turning the pages of a half-burnt notebook. The top edges are singed, but lower down, beneath the blackened crisp, a fragment remains. Boil it until the bitterness fades. Taste is not proof of failure. You don't know the author's name, but you know exactly what she meant. Tomorrow, you'll walk plague-swept streets where women once stepped into the roles of doctors, undertakers, and historians while those in power looked away. But tonight, you sleep beside a manuscript with no title, no author, and more brilliance than it knows what to do with. You wake to the sound of coughing, not the polite morning clearing kind, but the deep, wrenching sound of a world trying to breathe through a veil of ash. The bells that ring now don't mark feast days. They toll for the dead. The year is 1348, and you're in a city that's already lost track of how many lives it's buried. The Black Death has arrived, and with it, chaos, fear, and the quiet collapse of structure. Physicians have fled, priests keep their distance, but in back rooms and alleyways, under rag-wrapped mouths and in skirts tucked at the knees, women are still working. This is the moment where female healers step forward not for fame, not for praise, but because no one else will. Mainstream historical fact. During the peak years of the bubonic plague, many male doctors abandoned their posts, either fleeing the cities or falling sick themselves. In their absence, women, especially midwives, nuns, herbalists, and household caregivers became the front line of care, administering comfort, remedies, and often being the only hand to close the eyes of the dying. You follow a woman named Isabetta through a side street in Florence. She carries a satchel of cloth-wrapped herbs and vinegar-soaked rags. Her sleeves are stained. Her eyes are calm. "I don't argue with the priests anymore," she says. "They don't come to this quarter." She knocks on a door. No answer. She goes in anyway. Inside, a boy with the fever. A mother already gone. Isabetta sets to work. She checks the boy's tongue, his nails, the color beneath his eyes. She unrolls a bundle garlic paste, crushed yarrow, mint, and wine vinegar. "This won't cure him," she says, "but it may help him breathe. And his sister needs to see someone try." Fringe tidbit. In several plague-struck cities, records show women were hired as plague workers, sometimes officially by city councils, sometimes informally by neighborhoods. They were tasked with tending to the sick, cleaning homes, and disposing of bodies. Most went unnamed. A few were later accused of witchcraft for surviving. You walk into a convent-turned-hospital where nuns work with sleeves rolled, boiling linens in vats of lye and rinsing their hands in rosemary water. One shows you a ledger of deaths, each name followed by a symbol. A cross for the pious, a flower for the young, a blank space for the unbaptized. You ask what the asterisk means. "Touched by a woman's hand before dying," she says. Historians still argue how effective these female healers were during the plague. Some say their remedies were primitive. Others point out that what mattered was presence, not cure. In an era with no antibiotics, no sterile technique, and no understanding of bacteria, compassion became its own kind of medicine. You meet a woman who makes plague posies, bundles of sweet-smelling herbs stitched into cloth pouches and hung around the neck. "Lavender for hope," she says. "Rue for courage. Bay leaf for the lungs." You ask if it works. "Only when you believe it," she replies. "But I give one to everyone." In a village outside Avignon, an elderly healer sits in her doorway, grinding dried lemon peel into powder. "People say I never got sick." She tells you. "But I did. I just didn't die." "That's different." She hands you a small clay bead. "Wear it near the throat, or burn it. Either way, it'll feel like doing something." You see a letter smudged, ink running, written by a woman to her sister in a distant town. "I've washed 30 this week. I remember each face. I pray it counts for something." Fringe tidbit. Some female healers developed rudimentary quarantine procedures, isolating patients, boiling clothing, burning bedding. In one case, a woman in Lübeck established a rotating care schedule among neighborhood wives. Each family assigned one sick household per day. It's one of the earliest recorded models of community-managed disease control. You walk through a market street now silent. The stalls closed. The fruit shriveled on the vine. In the window of a closed bakery, a message scratched into the soot. She came. She tried. We are grateful. There's a dried sprig of thyme tied to the latch. In one town, you find a plague house marked with a red X. A girl peeks out the window and tosses you a bundle of herbs wrapped in twine. My mother made these. She says she didn't want them wasted. You catch it. It smells like juniper and resolve. The sun sets behind a stone wall dotted with ivy and names carved by someone who believed they wouldn't be remembered. You sit on the steps beside a healer scraping her tools clean. We don't do it for thanks, she says. Eyes on her blade. But we remember each one. That's the real record. Tomorrow, you'll step even deeper into secrecy where women dissect, draw, and diagnose behind closed doors, dodging accusation and shame with each scribbled diagram. But tonight, you sleep beside a bowl of boiled vinegar, a candle trimmed to last until dawn, and the memory of women who faced a plague armed with little more than hands, herbs, and the unbearable act of staying. The vinegar sting still lingers in your nose as you rise. But today the air is quieter like the breath between storms. You're walking through a manor's back courtyard just after rain. The cobblestones slick with moss. The air sharp with damp wood and iron. The garden is unkempt. The shutters closed. And somewhere inside, a woman is unrolling a vellum scroll not meant to exist. She lights a candle with shaking fingers. You step softly across the threshold. This is not an apothecary, not a convent. This is a private study. And the diagrams now spreading across the table show internal organs, tiny labeled arrows pointing at stomach linings, arteries, the curve of a liver. There are notes in a tight, angled hand, observed under candlelight, confirmed twice. Smell unpleasant. Mainstream historical fact. Despite strict restrictions, some medieval women, notably midwives, healers, and noble women with private tutors conducted rudimentary dissections of small animals or, on rare occasions, human bodies. These studies often went unrecorded or were hidden in household manuals. While universities barred women from anatomical lectures, many quietly made their own observations. Often under threat of prosecution or public shaming, you lean closer. A diagram of a uterus cut away with eerie precision, its parts labeled in both Latin and French. You ask if it's hers? The woman, older, with a streak of iron-gray hair and ink on her wrist, shrugs. Parts of it? The cow was mine. She explains she learned from a butcher's wife. She let me watch. Later, she dissected frogs, then rabbits, eventually a stillborn. Her notes are private, precise, unsigned. Fringe tidbit. In some cases, female healers kept anatomical sketchbooks, often hidden within recipe collections or disguised as religious meditations. One such book discovered in a Spanish manor contained side-by-side drawings of saints and fetal positions. The marginalia included dosage notes and predictions of labor length based on skull shape. In the back room, her daughter is sketching something onto a slate board. It's a rib cage. Too many ribs, the girl mutters. Erasing. He didn't stay still. You pause. You did this yourself. She nods. He was already gone. Then adds, it didn't feel sinful. Just curious. You help organize scrolls labeled with small coded symbols. A fish, a sprig of thyme, a tiny compass rose. The fish means cardiac. The thyme is digestive. The rose, that one's dangerous, she says. Womb theories. Not everyone likes them. Historians still argue whether women conducted legitimate anatomical studies in this era, or whether these stories are exaggerations of midwifery lore. But hidden manuscripts, strange diagrams, and accounts whispered through families suggest otherwise. They were studying, just not publicly, and not without cost. You sit by the window as she grinds charcoal into a powder, mixing it with wine and gum to make ink. "I write with what I have," she says, "and I draw what I see. That's how I learn." On her desk, a book attributed to a male physician, but annotated in a different hand. In the margins, "Liver does not swell this way. Tried 3 times. Another says, "Add clove if cutting tissue. Smell is better. It's critique by correction, carved in secrecy." Later, in the cellar, you find a collection of preserved animal organs floating in vinegar. Some are labeled in red, others in gold. One jar contains something that looks very human. You say nothing. Fringe tidbit. Some women, when accused of witchcraft, were found with anatomical models wooden, clay, even fabric used for teaching or practice. These were often misinterpreted as magical dolls. In at least one trial, a woman was condemned for possessing false entrails stitched from linen. You watch her finish an illustration of the eye, complete with optic nerve, tear duct, and notations about light. "He said it was divine radiance," she mutters, referring to a famous physician. "I think it's pressure and moisture." You ask if she'll sign it. She doesn't look up. "Not if I want my daughter to have this house." Night falls. She folds the vellum carefully, wraps it in cloth, and hides it beneath the loose floorboard behind the hearth. She hands you a cup of something warm bitter, herbal, possibly infused with clove and gilt. "I won't be remembered," she says, "but I remember tomorrow. You'll cross into the Byzantine and Islamic worlds, where women physicians practiced more openly, wrote under their own names, and taught in schools sometimes with state approval. But tonight, you sleep beside a quiet hearth in a house full of drawings that shouldn't exist, truths recorded in margins, and a woman who dared to document what she dared to see. You wake to the sound of sandals brushing against marble. A breeze carries the scent of jasmine and old books. Gone are the damp convent halls and soot-streaked laboratories. Now you're stepping through an arched courtyard of Constantinople, into a world where domes gleam and fountains murmur beneath mosaics that catch the rising sun like stained glass caught mid-prayer. You've entered the Byzantine and Islamic worlds, where women didn't just stitch remedies into cloth or scribble formulas in hidden rooms they wrote, taught, diagnosed, and, in rare but breathtaking cases, published under their own names. Mainstream historical fact. From the 9th to the 13th centuries, Byzantium and the Islamic caliphates offered more structured access to education for women than many of their European counterparts. Though not widespread, certain women, especially from elite or scholarly families, received formal medical training and even served as teachers, midwives, physicians, and authors, particularly in medicine, pharmacology, and astronomy. You walk into a small hospital wing attached to a palace compound, where a woman in a flowing tunic leans over a reclining patient. She's checking a pulse with 2 fingers, watching his face for signs of pain. "He ate lamb too quickly," she says. "Not serious, just arrogant." You suppress a smile. Her name is Metrodora, or at least that's the name in her treatise. She may be fictionalized by time, a composite, or a real physician whose work was copied endlessly. Her On the Diseases and Cures of Women was one of the earliest known gynecological texts written in Greek, and it survived long enough to be translated into Arabic, Latin, and used well into the Renaissance. She invites you to her writing room, cool, clean, and lined with scrolls. on one parchment. Diagrams of the uterus sit beside notes on prolapsed organs, menstrual pain, and fertility salves. Nothing metaphorical here, just clean observation and clear advice. Fringe tidbit Metrodora's work includes one of the earliest written descriptions of breast cancer, recognizing it as a hard mass distinct from other tissue, and without knowing it suggesting a primitive understanding of malignancy. She didn't call it cancer. She just knew it was bad, and she tracked how often it came back. Later, in a courtyard shaded by orange trees, you meet a group of women studying a text by Avicenna, each scribbling commentary into the margins with sharp-tipped reeds. One leans over and says, "He's too dramatic about phlegm. We know how to sweat it out without poetry." They giggle. You ask if they're students. One replies, "Aren't we all?" You travel farther east, into Baghdad, into the House of Wisdom. There you meet another scholar, Rufaida al-Aslamia, a name that surfaces again and again in whispered reverence. A pioneering nurse, teacher, and battlefield medic. Rufaida is believed to have trained other women in medicine, both in theory and practice. She wrote with care. One scribe says, "and bandaged faster than fear." Historians still debate the extent of her influence. Was she an exception or part of a larger group of female practitioners? The record is cloudy, but the echoes are loud. Her name appears in tales, in lineage, in footnotes written with pride. You visit an apothecary where a woman in a richly embroidered robe is organizing powders by texture, not just color. Dryness is only half the problem, she says, handing you a pinch of ground fenugreek. Feel that? It clumps. That means humidity. You nod solemnly. You have no idea what you're holding. She points to a text written in careful Kufic script. My mother's, she says, she invented a cooling syrup for inflamed throats. Doctors copied it. Never her name. She shrugs, but I remember. In a tiled room behind the courtyard, you meet a woman studying lunar tables for dosing schedules. Some herbs are stronger under waxing moons, she says, and some poisons fade faster when Saturn is near. You want to ask more, but she's already gone back to her calculations, her long row of numbers stretching like stars on the floor. Fringe tidbit. In Islamic Spain, records survive of female physicians granted licenses to practice medicine, particularly in obstetrics and women's health. These weren't honorary titles. These were official, city-approved, exam-passed doctors. And though few names remain, the licenses do. You end the day walking through a rose garden beside a university where both male and female scholars once debated Galenic theory. You spot an inscription carved into a stone fountain, faded but still legible. Truth has no gender, only clarity. Tomorrow, you'll return to the more domestic sphere where the same hands that embroidered altar cloths were also stitching wounds, tying off arteries, and performing proto-surgery beneath candlelight. But tonight, you sleep beneath tiled domes and calligraphy-covered ceilings, the cool air scented with cardamom and ink, your dreams filled with women who sign their names not in secret but in stone, vellum, and memory. You wake to the rhythm of thread tugging through linen, the gentle pull and pat of fingers coaxing tension into order. You're no longer in grand libraries or perfumed gardens. You're back in a quiet room. Smaller. Simpler, its only decoration a faded tapestry. Its only music, the soft hiss of a coal fire. This is not a surgical theater. But what happens here is cutting-edge work, literally. You're sitting on a low stool next to a woman who has the steady hands of a saint and the unflinching eyes of someone who's seen too many bad stitches. In her lap is a piece of cloth stretched taut across a frame, but it's no altar cloth. It's flesh-colored linen, and she's practicing sutures on it like a pianist rehearsing scales. Mainstream historical fact. In the medieval world, especially among midwives, monastic caregivers, and some noble households, women performed basic surgical procedures suturing wounds, draining abscesses, setting minor fractures. With no access to universities, they learned through hands-on practice, often repurposing the skills of needlework, embroidery, and weaving into medical technique. She sets aside her practice cloth and rolls up her sleeves. "Flesh tears like silk," she mutters, but not as predictably. You glance at her tools, thin curved needles, bone-handled scissors, gut thread soaking in vinegar, and what looks like a darning awl modified for drainage. Beside her sits a box marked "for bleeders." She demonstrates with a dried pig's foot, slicing just enough to mimic a wound, then stitching it closed in small, even loops. "Don't pull too tight," she says. "It'll pucker." You nod, mesmerized. Fringe tidbit. Some surviving 14th century manuscripts on surgery include notes in the margins believed to be written by women, critiquing suture angles and suggesting alternatives for tools. One particularly candid comment beside a cauterization diagram reads, "Only if you're out of thread and out of time." Later, you watch her clean and dress a shallow arm wound for a shepherd boy who caught himself on a thistle-covered fence. She disinfects the cut with wine vinegar, applies crushed comfrey root, and stitches it closed with alarming calm. "Don't move," she says, "unless you want to brag about this scar later." You help her prepare bandages, strips of linen boiled with rosemary and thyme, dried on racks beside the hearth. She prefers double-folded seams, reinforced with wax if the patient is likely to sweat. "Sailors and dancers," she says. "The same rules apply." Historians still argue whether these acts qualify as surgery in the strict sense, or if they fall under the vague umbrella of women's healing. But the line is thin. If you're cutting flesh, closing vessels, and improvising scalpels out of sharpened bone, you're operating, even if no one gives you the title. You peek into her supply chest, where beside the expected oils and powders are bundles of fine embroidery needles, repurposed into makeshift scalpels. It's not the shape, she tells you. It's the steadiness. Her hands, unsurprisingly, don't tremble. In a nearby convent, you meet another woman older, slower, but still sharp. She shows you a stitched anatomical sampler, a teaching tool passed between nuns. Each square features a different layer of tissue, rendered in thread red for muscle, gold for nerves, silver for veins. "We learn with fingers first," she says. "Eyes second. Books third." Fringe tidbit. Some surgical techniques were disguised as embroidery instructions in household manuals describing, for instance, how to bind a rosebud after tearing, which actually referred to postpartum suturing. Euphemisms were necessary, especially when male editors came sniffing. You spend the afternoon learning how to wrap a joint with tension to reduce swelling, how to apply honey-smeared linen for infection, how to recognize stitches that will hold versus those that will unravel with one unlucky sneeze. It's clinical. It's elegant. It's brutal when necessary. One woman tells you about repairing torn ears after street fights. Another about emergency tracheotomy attempts on boys who swallowed fish bones. "Most died," she says, "but one didn't." You ask what she used. "Quill pen," she replies, like it's obvious. "Hollowed out. We all write with breath anyway." By evening, the room smells of boiled linen, melted beeswax, and the unmistakable tang of blood that's been cleaned but not quite forgotten. You sit near the hearth, hands still sore from practicing on embroidery hoops reinforced with pigskin. Tomorrow, you'll walk into the hazy world of healing by the stars where medicine blends with astrology, and women read birth charts alongside prescriptions. But tonight, you lie beneath a quilt someone stitched between surgeries, each square probably made after some quietly heroic act. Your dreams are of threads that hold fast, wounds that close clean, and women whose needles once meant for hems found their true calling in the space between life and loss. You wake to the low, rolling chant of dawn prayers and the smell of candle smoke mingling with crushed anise. Today, you follow threads made not of silk or sinew, but starlight. For this chapter of your journey, you're stepping into the strange and spellbinding world where medicine, mysticism, and the cosmos all braid together, and where women, once again, were doing far more than simply watching the sky. You sit beside a woman hunched over a chart the size of a baking sheet. It's covered in constellations, phases, and symbols that look vaguely like crop circles met a handwriting contest. She's calculating a birth chart, not for fortune-telling, for diagnosis. Mainstream historical fact. During the Middle Ages, medical astrology was standard practice in both Islamic and Christian territories. It was believed that the positions of stars, planets, and moon phases affected the body's health, especially the humors. Physicians consulted celestial charts to determine when to bleed a patient, when to administer medicine, or when a wound would best heal. And while formal astrologers were typically men, women, particularly midwives and herbalists, quietly kept their own astrological records, blending sky reading with healing. You ask what she's reading. She squints, runs a finger over a curved line near the moon. Born during a waning crescent, she says, likely to have weak digestion and a fear of crowds. You blink. It's uncomfortably accurate. She hands you a herbal horoscope, a parchment guide matching zodiac signs to common ailments and treatments. Virgo liver congestion, best treated with dandelion root. Pisces melancholy, prone to excessive tears, best soothed with thyme and licorice root. Fringe tidbit. In some regions, women stitched zodiac wheels into birthing blankets, using specific colors and symbols to match the child's projected temperament. One surviving example even includes embroidered planet hours, intended to time contractions with Jupiter's favor. You enter a chamber lit only by a high window, where a nun draws circles in charcoal on a chalkboard slab. This is Saturn's path this month, she murmurs, and that means swelling in the legs is likely to increase. Another woman adds, especially among bakers, Saturn hates gluten. They both snort with laughter. You love them instantly. Nearby, a young girl is stirring a pot of herbal tea while referencing a moon table scratched into a wax tablet. Boil until the planet is in Aries, she mutters. You raise an eyebrow. Or for exactly 8 minutes, she adds, rolling her eyes. Whichever comes first. Historians still argue how much medieval astrology was scientific insight versus cultural tradition. But it's clear that it wasn't fringe, it was considered part of serious medicine, especially among women who lacked access to university training but relied on patterns, nature, and timing as tools of the trade. You peek into a collection of notebooks filled with drawings of human figures overlaid with zodiac symbols. There's a man with Sagittarius over his thighs, Pisces along his feet, and Leo curled around the heart. Zodiac man, someone says. We use him to know where not to cut. You ask how she learned to read stars. She smiles. From my mother's window, and from her mother's spoons. You don't question it. At a nearby herbal stall, A woman arranges jars under the light of a high window, whispering to herself. This one for Mars, she says, pointing to nettle. This one for Venus, motioning to rose petals. And this one? Well, no one likes Mercury, but sometimes you need him. She hands you a vial of peppermint and rosemary oil. This is for clarity, she says. When you're feeling moon-drenched and Jupiter's gone missing, you don't understand it fully, but it makes more sense than you'd care to admit. Fringe tidbit. In some courts, noble women kept astrological herb gardens, planting according to planetary calendars and using moon cycles to determine harvest times. Certain plants were only cut during full moons to retain their humors, while others were forbidden during eclipses. You find yourself at the edge of a low stone wall, where a midwife traces symbols in the dirt with the stick, explaining which days are safe for conception based on the positions of Mars and the moon. It's not magic, she says. It's watching. Then adds, and a little prayer never hurts. She pulls a small book from her pocket, wrapped in fabric. Inside a chart matching lunar phases with reported birth complications, along with annotations like rainy day, child arrived upside down, and eclipse plus colic Sarbwasser disaster. You realize she's not relying on the stars blindly? She's tracking, adjusting, refining just as any scientist might. Her tools are older, her language more poetic, but the process, the method, it's still observation, plus interpretation, plus care. As evening falls, you lie back on a bench beside her and stare at the sky. Jupiter is a bright pinprick just above the horizon. The moon is waxing, full of promise and complications. She points out constellations by name. That one gives you courage. That one just watches. Tomorrow, you'll journey into darker corners where the work of women like her begins to draw suspicion, and the line between medicine and heresy grows treacherously thin. But tonight, you rest beneath stars that once told fortunes, dictated surgeries, and shaped entire healing traditions, all while women took notes beneath the glow. You wake before sunrise, and the sky is already holding its breath. Gone are the soft stars and good-natured sky gazers. Today, the air is tighter, thinner. The walls whisper. Because today, you step into a world where knowing too much could be mistaken for sorcery, where an herbal chart looks suspiciously like a hex, and where the act of recording symptoms with too much accuracy might get you accused of speaking with the devil. This is the era of watchers and not the kind that chart stars. You're in a small village, nestled in a valley that feels deliberately difficult to find. A woman is drying bundles of mugwort and sage above her fireplace. She's been doing it for years, but now she does it with the shutters drawn. Her notes are hidden in a hollowed-out stool. Her tinctures are labeled in rhyme, so no one, not even her own children, can read them too easily. Mainstream historical fact. By the late Middle Ages, especially in the 15th and 16th centuries, the line between medicine and witchcraft blurred dangerously. Women who had once been trusted midwives, herbalists, and local healers began to draw suspicion. Some were charged with heresy or sorcery simply for knowing too much about the body, or curing what a priest's prayers could not. She invites you to sit, offers you a small cup of rosehip and valerian. For the nerves, she says, though you look steady, you're not in this room, where everything feels borrowed and one question away from an inquisition. You glance at her shelf. A few books, some scrolls, a wooden box carved with crescent moons and botanical curls. Never call it a grimoire, she warns. That's what they want to hear. Fringe tidbit. Some women disguised medical knowledge as religious allegory encoding herbal remedies and psalms, diagrams of anatomy within visions of saints, or menstrual charts disguised as liturgical calendars. In one known case, a woman described her work as healing through the Virgin's Garden Code for uterine care using marjoram, hyssop, and raspberry leaf. You help her prepare a compress for a woman across the village with swelling in her legs. She was afraid to call me. Your host says. Said her brother-in-law's reading about witches again. She sighs. He couldn't find his own liver with a lantern. The tension is real. Outside, in the town square, you hear a man lecturing about sin, impurity, and the dangers of female interference with divine punishment. His robe is heavy. His mouth foams like an overworked baker. No one looks him in the eye. You return to the cottage. The woman shows you a diagram she's drawn of a fetus in utero beautiful, detailed, and far more accurate than anything printed in university texts of the same era. I used a sheep once, she admits. And my niece, not at the same time. She's mapped the body in ways considered too intimate, too physical, too exacting. Men can draw saints being pierced with swords, she says. But if I draw a womb, it's a sin. Historians still argue whether midwives and herbalists were truly persecuted en masse, or whether the infamous witch trials targeted a specific subset. But there's no question that many women of knowledge were silenced, erased, or burned not for sorcery, but for being inconvenient. You sit with her and read her notes by firelight. Remedies for night sweats, joint pain, sour breath. She's even marked some with phases of the moon. She calls it weathering the body. You call it data? Fringe tidbit. Some women employed coded alphabets, writing their treatises in backwards Latin, herbal cipher, or even musical notation. In one remarkable case, a surviving manuscript was written entirely in botanical metaphors. When the poppy wilts, it is time for mint. Modern scholars believe it was a menstruation calendar disguised as gardening advice. You help her tie bundles of thyme with twine, placing each in a clay jar marked with scratches too subtle to be letters. If they come, she says, hide in the goat shed. And don't answer to your own name. The fear isn't paranoia. She tells you of a neighbor, another healer, another woman with too many salves and too few friends dragged before the magistrate for practicing lunar manipulation. In reality, she timed her healing with tides. They couldn't understand it, your host says, so they feared it. Later, you sit beneath a pear tree and watch as the moon rises round and careless. She hands you a small stitched cloth. On it, a spiral of herbs, moons, and stars. It's everything I know, she says, and none of it. You fold it gently. It smells like rosemary and resistance. Tomorrow, you'll rise to find their names buried, if not by flames, then by the absence of credit, and yet you'll also begin to trace their slow rediscovery. But tonight, you lie wrapped in a quilt that once covered birthing women, dreaming in code, cradled by knowledge kept quiet for survival. And outside, the moon watches it all, as it always has, unafraid, unmoved, and fully alight. You rise into a morning heavy with fog, not the weather kind, but the kind that rolls in after generations of silence. You feel it in your shoulders, your breath. You're walking now through cold university halls in Paris, Oxford, Bologna, places where the marble floors echo not with chatter, but with the names that aren't spoken. You're not here to meet new women of science. You're here to find the ones who've been scrubbed out. The shelves here are tall. The books are thick. The names on the spines are mostly men. Galen, Avicenna, Hippocrates, Galen again. A few later ones, Paracelsus. Vesalius, Harvey. But you flip through pages and every now and then you see it. A marginal note, a footnote without an author, a surgical technique described in the voice of a woman, but published under a man's name, or worse, under no name at all. Mainstream historical fact. As medical science became increasingly professionalized, especially in the 16th and 17th centuries, women were systematically pushed out. Universities refused their admission. Guilds barred their practice. Printing presses erased their contributions. Manuscripts once copied or compiled by women were rewritten, renamed, and published under male authority. In many cases, this wasn't fire and pitchfork erasure. It was administrative. You run your finger along a passage describing a birthing stool, modified to reduce strain on the spine. The footnote credits a monk physician in Palermo. You pause. You've seen this design before, back in Salerno, in a midwife's journal, with notes in the margin like works better when mother grips elbows and asks her what feels natural. Those weren't a monk's hands. You know it. You step into a records room filled with death certificates. Beside many names attended by unnamed woman, or no physician available. Delivered by servant. You blink. The word they're reaching for is midwife. But even that vanishes when the ink fades. Fringe tidbit. There's a 15th century university textbook attributed to a French physician which includes entire herbal chapters, lifted verbatim from earlier anonymous manuscripts written in a hand now known to match a Benedictine convent's scriptorium. It took modern handwriting analysis to uncover the truth. The theft was centuries old. The correction took 5 minutes and 500 years. You meet a historian tucked into an office so cramped it smells like dust and dried ink. She shows you a folder of documents letters, herbal diagrams, anatomy drawings all signed anonymous. She's cross-referencing them with family records and convent registries. I'm hunting ghosts, she says, but they leave fingerprints. She opens a letter, dated 1492. The Latin is flowery but sharp. The writer critiques a surgical technique, recommends lavender oil for the stitching, and suggests better patient positioning during bladder repair. Written, the historian notes, by a woman who signs only as God's servant. She smiles. Not a bad alias. Historians still argue whether this erasure was systemic or incidental. Some say the institutions simply followed the norms of their time. Others call it what it was, a theft in slow motion, truth packaged in the wrong voice, genius edited for tone. You find a printed treatise from the 1500s on fertility herbs. It's praised for its innovation, but hidden in the preface is a note adapted from older household teachings gathered by village wives. No names, no credits, no citations. Just a breezy nod to ancient domestic wisdom. You shut the book harder than you meant to. Outside, in a courtyard where the ivy has overgrown the statues, you sit beside a plaque honoring fathers of European medicine. You feel the ghosts gathering behind your shoulder. Not vengeful, just present. Fringe tidbit. Some women sign their work in textile codes a row of cross stitches that match their initials, or thread patterns that referenced family names. These were never included when the work was recopied. The thread didn't survive the translation. You ask the historian how many women have been lost. She sighs. We don't even know how to count them. The erasure is so complete it feels normal. But she smiles too. The good news ink fades, but the work leaves marks. You walk once more through a library, touching bindings, flipping pages, looking for the margins, the erasures, the voices you now recognize not by name, but by rhythm, the way they describe pain. the way they measure heat, the way they write not to impress, but to help. Tomorrow, you'll walk into a brighter room where those ghosts are finally being called by name. Their manuscripts pulled from drawers, their notes digitized, their signatures restored. But tonight, you rest among the unnamed knowing their silence was never absence, only interruption. You wake with a soft tick of an electric clock echoing faintly through the archives. It's not medieval bells this time, it's modern time. Real, fluorescent, paper tag now. The fog of erasure still lingers, but the light is different here. Brighter, not yet warm, but warming. Because this is the part of the story where the women come back. You step into a university archive lined with climate-controlled cabinets and folders labeled, not in Latin, but in printed, modern fonts. A young researcher in oversized glasses waves you in. She's holding a manuscript, and she's practically vibrating with excitement. You want to see what someone almost forgot to forget. Mainstream historical fact. Over the last century, especially in the past few decades, historians, scholars, and archivists, many of them women, have begun uncovering the vast legacy of medieval female scientists, healers, and physicians. What was once scattered in footnotes and folklore is slowly being gathered, digitized, restored, and finally recognized. She spreads out the manuscript on a light, safe table. Its old parchment browned at the edges, ink faded to a rusty brown, but the diagrams are precise, labeled, and in the margin, a note. My mother wrote this, I have only copied, no last name, but it's a start. You pass through a hallway lined with recent dissertations, reconstructing Trotula Salernitan medicine and female authorship. The herbal manuscripts of the Benedictine nuns of Rupertsberg, revisiting the zodiac birth charts in medieval midwifery. They're not footnotes anymore. They're titles. You meet a scholar cataloging over 300 botanical entries from a convent's surviving herbal, previously attributed to an anonymous monk. Turns out the scribe was Sister Theophania. She says, flipping a page, left-handed, favorite ink color violet, and she doodled animals in the margins when she was bored. She points to a tiny goat wearing a halo. You grin. Fringe tidbit. Some universities now run courses dedicated to medieval women in STEM science, technology, engineering, medicine, and a few even partner with monasteries and convents to digitize their libraries, making centuries-old works available to scholars worldwide. You walk through a museum exhibit dedicated to the hidden scientists of the Middle Ages. There's Hildegard's herbal, recreated and annotated by contemporary biologists. There's Trotula's text, now linked with modern gynecology. There's Metrodora's anatomical descriptions compared with MRI data. It's not a stretch, it's a timeline. At one display, a modern surgeon talks about how medieval suture patterns informed field medicine techniques during early wars. They weren't unsophisticated, he says. They were smart with what they had, and their survival rates were sometimes better. A young woman stands beside you, reading slowly from a backlit tablet. If the wound is clean and warm, let it rest. If the patient cries, hold her hand. Pain is not a punishment, it is a signal. She turns to you, eyes wide. She wrote that in 1432. You sit in a lecture hall where students debate whether Hildegard was a proto-psychologist, whether monastic eclipse recordings contributed to modern astronomy, whether the color codings in early herbal charts indicate observational chemistry. They argue fiercely, with citations. It's glorious. You walk past a display case of preserved tools, curved needles, vinegar vials, parchment strips covered in tightly drawn organs. One is labeled replica of a surgical sampler used for nuns in training. C. 1350. Another code wheel for calculating menstrual cycles and feast days. Historians still argue where the line between medicine and mysticism lies, but they're arguing on panels now, not in whispers. The work is being taken seriously, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. Fringe tidbit. A recent AI analysis of handwriting in medieval manuscripts identified dozens of female scribes, based on style, hand size, and unique letter shapes rewriting centuries of assumptions about who authored what. Even the ghosts leave fingerprints. As the day closes, you wander back to the archive where it all began. The researcher hands you a small scanned folio, a herbal chart, annotated with dates, moon phases, and strange symbols. We're translating it now, she says, but it's already taught me more than 2 semesters of pharmacology. You smile and fold the page carefully. Then, for a moment, you imagine the women you've walked beside: Hildegard, Trotula, Metrodora, the anonymous nuns, the midwives with garlic hands, the girls with stitched zodiac codes, and you realize something important. They were never truly gone, just waiting to be read properly. And now the ink dries. The stars fade from your chart. The scent of rosemary, parchment, and iron cools into the quiet folds of night. You've walked long through abbeys and apothecaries, manuscripts and memory, shadowed kitchens and glass-lit towers, each space holding the echo of a woman who dared to observe, to heal, to remember. Let it settle. Let the voices that history once swallowed speak again in your memory, not in grand declarations, but in gentle truths written in the margins. A pressure point here, a stitch there, the position of the moon, the smell of mint when the fever breaks. They weren't seeking immortality, just understanding, just relief, just continuity. Their work wasn't loud. It didn't thunder or shine with crowns. It was quiet, consistent, composed in bone-white script on nights when the fire barely held. It was sung under breath, boiled in pots, stitched into the seams of labor gowns. It was science before the word wore a lab coat. And now you carry it, gently. So close your eyes. Feel the pulse of a remembered hand at your wrist. Hear the flick of pages turning just past your ear. Let the rhythm of their work steady, circular, unfinished lull you. Let go! Let the silence now be soft. Not erasure, but peace. You have learned, you have listened, and now you sleep.